It was a Tuesday afternoon in Harlem when the unspoken rule was broken. The air was thick with humidity, but for 70-year-old Mame Johnson, the world had suddenly turned freezing cold. On the sidewalk of 112th Street, a mahogany rocking chair lay overturned, its legs snapped in half. Beside it sat a pile of clothes, a Bible, and a weeping old woman. She hadn't failed to pay rent. She hadn't caused a disturbance. She was simply the target of a message sent by the new police chief to the most dangerous man in New York. The neighborhood watched from behind their curtains, terrified. No one dared to help. To help her was to defy the police. To ignore her was to disrespect her grandson. It was a lose-lose situation. The silence on the block was heavy, broken only by the sound of a heavy engine approaching. A sleek, black Lincoln. Zephyr turned the corner. It didn't speed. It glided like a shark through water. The car stopped directly in front of the pile of belongings. The driver's door didn't open. Instead, the back door swung wide. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped out. He wasn't wearing a scowl. His face was a mask of terrifying calm. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than the building his grandmother had just been kicked out of. He adjusted his cufflinks, walked over to the weeping woman, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. He didn't look at the broken furniture. He looked up at the empty window where the eviction notice was taped. "Who did this, Mama?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, like gravel wrapped in silk. She couldn't speak. She just pointed toward the precinct. Bumpy nodded once. He didn't yell. He didn't pull a gun. He simply helped her into the back of the Lincoln. As the car pulled away, everyone on the street knew one thing. The police chief hadn't just evicted a tenant. He'd just signed his own death warrant. While Mame Johnson was shivering on the sidewalk, the man responsible was sitting comfortably in a high-back leather chair. The smell of cheap cigar smoke and stale coffee clinging to the walls of his office. Chief Thomas Bulldog Higgins didn't look like a man who had just committed a crime. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. He was a mountain of a man, with a neck that spilled over his collar and knuckles scarred from years of interrogations that usually involved a phone book and a nightstick. Higgins wasn't from Harlem. He had been transferred from downtown just 3 weeks prior, brought in to clean up the streets. But in Higgins' vocabulary, cleaning up meant shaking down. Every business owner, numbers runner, and corner store for a protection fee. If you paid, the police looked the other way. If you didn't, you had accidents. And Bumpy Johnson. He hadn't paid. Earlier that morning, a nervous sergeant had tried to warn him. "Chief," the officer had whispered, looking over his shoulder. "You can't just throw that woman out. That's Bumpy's blood. You touch her, and the whole neighborhood is gonna turn on us." Higgins had laughed, a wet, hacking sound that rattled his chest. "Bumpy Johnson is a thug in a suit," he spat, slamming his fist on the desk. "He thinks he's a king because you cowards let him be one. I'm the law here. I wear the badge. I hold the gun. If he wants to play games, I'll show him how the game is really played." The eviction wasn't about the rent. It was a power move. Higgins knew that Bumpy was too smart to attack a police chief directly. That would bring the FBI, the National Guard, and the heat of the entire city down on Harlem. Higgins was banking on Bumpy's intelligence paralyzing him. He thought he had checkmated the gangster by hiding behind the shield of the NYPD. He leaned back, propping his boots up on his desk, watching the sun begin to dip lower through the blinds. He imagined Bumpy scrambling, humiliated, looking for a place for the old woman to sleep. It made Higgins smile. He felt untouchable. He felt like a god. But Higgins made the classic mistake of a bully. He confused patience with weakness. He didn't understand that men like Bumpy Johnson didn't get mad, they got even. As the chief reached for the bottle of whiskey in his bottom drawer to celebrate his victory, The lights in his office flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The precinct went black. The phone on his desk gave a short ring, then went dead. Bulldog Higgins struck a match, the small flame illuminating the confusion on his face. He didn't know it yet, but the siege had just begun. While Chief Higgins was fumbling with matches in the dark. 5 blocks away, inside the dimly lit back room of the finest chess club in Harlem, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was staring at a board. He held a white knight between his fingers, rolling it back and forth. The room was silent, save for the nervous pacing of his right-hand man, Nat. "Bump, you can't be serious," Nat hissed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That's the police chief." "The chief? If we touch him, the feds will roll tanks down 125th Street. It's a suicide mission. We've spent 10 years building this empire. You really gonna burn it all down over an eviction?" Bumpy finally looked up. His eyes were unreadable. "It's not about the eviction, Nat. It's about the precedent." 2. Understand why Bumpy Johnson was about to do the impossible. You have to understand who he was. He wasn't your average gangster. They didn't call him the professor for nothing. While other mobsters were busy flexing their muscles and buying flashy cars, Bumpy was reading philosophy, history, and studying law. He had spent time in some of the hardest prisons in America, including Alcatraz. And he had learned one vital lesson. Violence is a tool, but intelligence is a weapon. Most criminals played checkers, jumping one piece at a time, reacting to what was in front of them. Bumpy played chess. He saw 10 moves ahead. He knew that if he let the chief get away with disrespecting his grandmother, his reputation would crumble. If the streets saw he couldn't protect his own blood, he couldn't protect his numbers runners, his business partners, or his territory. Weakness was a scent, and wolves like Higgins could smell it from a mile away. But Nat was right about one thing. Going to war with the NYPD using guns was stupid. If Bumpy sent men to shoot up the chief's house, he would lose. The system always protects its own against a direct attack. "We aren't going to war, Nat," Bumpy said softly, finally placing the knight down on the board with a sharp clack. "War is noisy. War is messy. We are going to conduct a siege." He stood up, smoothing out his suit jacket. "The chief thinks his badge makes him a god. But a god needs worshippers. A god needs power. A god needs comfort." Bumpy walked to the window. Looking out at the city, he ruled. "Tonight, we strip him of his humanity. We don't touch a hair on his head. We don't fire a single bullet. But by the time the sun comes up tomorrow, that man will wish he had never been born." He turned back to his men. The fear in the room had vanished, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. "Cut the phone lines to his house," Bumpy ordered. "Divert the water main and tell the boys to park the trucks. I want a wall of steel around his property. If he wants to act like a king, let's see how he likes living in a castle under siege." The king of Harlem had made his move. The pieces were in motion, and the chief was playing a game he didn't even know the rules to. Chief Higgins lived in a nice 2-story house in Queens, a world away from the grit of Harlem. It was his sanctuary, bought and paid for with the dirty money he skimmed off the top of his precinct's seizures. As he pulled his cruiser into the driveway that evening, he was on edge. His hand hovered near his service revolver. He expected a drive-by shooting. He expected a Molotov cocktail through the living room window. He expected the loud, chaotic violence of the streets. But when he stepped out of his car, he was met with something far more unsettling. Silence. The streetlights on his block were out. All of them. The rest of the neighborhood was glowing with the warm hum of electricity, but his block was a void of darkness. Higgins squinted, confused, and marched up his front steps. He unlocked the door and flipped the switch in the hallway. Nothing. "Damn fuses," he grumbled, tossing his keys on the table. He navigated the dark house by memory, heading for the kitchen. He was sweating. The air inside was stagnant and hot. He reached for the faucet to splash some cold water on his face. He turned the handle. A hollow hiss echoed from the pipes, followed by a pathetic sputter of brown rust. Then, silence. No lights. No fans. No water. Panic began to prick at the back of his neck. This wasn't a coincidence. This was infrastructure failure on a surgical level. He grabbed the rotary phone on the wall to call the utility company, or maybe the station to send a squad car. He lifted the receiver to his ear. There was no dial tone, just the dead, empty static of a severed line. Higgins slammed the receiver down, his breathing becoming heavy. He rushed to the front window and peeled back the curtains. That's when he saw it. At the north end of the street, a massive delivery truck for a commercial laundry service was parked horizontally across the road, blocking both lanes. At the south end, a heavy-duty construction flatbed was parked the same way. There was no way in and no way out. Bumpy hadn't sent hitmen to kick down the door. He had sent union workers. It sent the city's infrastructure against the chief. Bumpy Johnson controlled the labor unions, the dock workers, and the utility crews. With a single phone call, he had effectively erased Chief Higgins from the grid. Inside the house, the temperature seemed to rise 10 degrees in an instant. The fridge was already leaking a puddle of water onto the linoleum floor. The food was spoiling. The toilet wouldn't flush. The chief was trapped in a box that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. He was prepared for a gunfight. He knew how to shoot back. But you can't shoot a power outage. You can't arrest a dry faucet. Bumpy Johnson was showing him that true power wasn't a badge or a gun. True power was the ability to turn a man's castle into a cage without ever stepping foot on the property. The siege had begun, and the chief was already losing. The sun finally vanished, taking the last shred of Chief Higgins' courage with it. The house was now pitch black, a hollow shell of heat and shadows. Without air conditioning, the air inside had become heavy, smelling of sweat and the rot of the garbage he couldn't take out. Higgins sat on the floor of his hallway, clutching his service revolver so tight his knuckles were white. He was waiting for the sound of breaking glass. He was waiting for the roar of an engine. He was waiting for something, but the only thing attacking him was the silence. It was a silence so deep it felt heavy, pressing against his eardrums. In Queens, there was always noise-distant traffic, a barking dog, the hum of the city. Tonight, the world had stopped. It was as if his house had been cut out of the map and dropped into a void. Higgins couldn't take it anymore. The waiting was worse than the fighting. He crawled to the living room window, moving slowly, trying to stay below the sill. He reached up and parted the curtains just an inch to peek outside. His breath caught in his throat. The streetlights were still out, but the darkness wasn't empty. Lining the sidewalk, standing shoulder to shoulder, were men. Dozens of them. They weren't hiding in the bushes. They weren't ducking behind cars. They were standing in plain sight, right at the edge of his lawn. They wore dark suits and fedoras, their silhouettes cutting sharp figures against the moonlight. They stood like statues, unmoving, their arms crossed or hanging loosely by their sides. There were no weapons visible, no baseball bats, no Tommy guns. Just a wall of men staring directly at his front door. Higgins watched, mesmerized by the sheer discipline of it. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't laugh. The only movement came from the occasional flicker of a lighter, flaring up to ignite a cigarette. For a split second, the flame would illuminate a face hard, stoic, unforgiving, before disappearing back into the night. Then, the glowing orange tips of the cigarettes would float in the dark like the eyes of predatory animals. Jesus, Higgins whispered, stumbling back from the window. He scrambled for his police radio, the portable unit he kept for emergencies. This was an emergency. He was an officer of the law under siege. He cranked the volume knob and pressed the transmit button. This is Chief Higgins, officer in distress. 10 to 13 at my residence. I have hostile targets outside. Send backup. Send everyone. He released the button and waited for the crackle of a response. He waited for the dispatcher's voice. He waited for the siren's static. Just the rhythmic, mocking hiss of white noise. He tried again, screaming into the receiver until his voice was raw. Nothing. Bumpy hadn't just cut the phone lines. He must have had men jamming the frequency or intercepting the calls. Or, worse, Bumpy had paid off the dispatcher. In that moment, the terrifying reality hit Higgins like a physical blow. He wasn't the police chief anymore. Tonight, he was just a man alone in the dark. He looked back at the window. The orange embers of the cigarettes burned bright, a silent vigil of judgment. They weren't going to attack. They didn't have to. They were letting the fear do the work. They were letting him stew in his own sweat and terror, knowing that every minute that ticked by was another crack in his sanity. They were waiting for him to break. And looking at his trembling hands, Higgins knew it wouldn't take long. It was 3 a.m. when the door to the chief's house finally creaked open. Chief Higgins looked like a ghost of the man he had been 12 hours earlier. His uniform shirt was unbuttoned, stained with dark patches of sweat. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He held his hands up, palms open, trembling. He had left his gun inside. He knew it was useless now. He stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under his weight. The wall of men on the sidewalk didn't flinch. They didn't rush him. They simply parted down the middle, like the Red Sea, creating a path at the end of that path. Sitting on the hood of the black Lincoln Zephyr was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was smoking a cigar, the smoke curling lazily into the night air. He looked rested. He looked calm. He looked like he was enjoying a pleasant evening breeze, not orchestrating a siege. He hopped off the hood of the car and walked slowly up the driveway, stopping 10 feet from the porch. "You win," Higgins croaked, his voice parched and cracking. "I'll pay, whatever the fee is, double the protection money. Triple. Just not call them off. Turn the water back on." Bumpy looked at the chief with a look of mild confusion, as if Higgins was speaking a foreign language. He took a slow drag of his cigar and exhaled. "You think this is about money, Chief?" Bumpy asked. "You think you can buy respect with an envelope of cash?" Higgins wiped his eyes. "What do you want, Johnson?" "I can get the charges dropped." You put an old woman on the street?" Bumpy interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air sharper than a knife. "You took a 70-year-old woman, my blood and you, threw her out like trash. You made her sleep in the cold." Bumpy took a step closer. The menace radiating off him was palpable. "You took her comfort. So now, I'm taking yours." Higgins blinked. "What?" "My grandmother needs a place to stay," Bumpy said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Her apartment is boarded up, thanks to you. So she needs a new room. A nice room. A room with a big bed, soft sheets, and maybe a view of the garden." Bumpy pointed a manicured finger at the open front door behind Higgins. "She's taking the master bedroom." Higgins' jaw dropped. You ... You can't be serious." "That's my house. My bed." "Not tonight, it isn't," Bumpy replied coldly. "Tonight, it's hers. You wanted to play landlord. Fine. You're evicted. From the bedroom, anyway. You can sleep on the porch. It's a warm night. You'll be fine." Higgins looked around at the wall of silent men. He looked at the darkness of his home. He realized he had two choices. He could refuse and likely disappear from the face of the earth before sunrise. Or he could swallow his pride, let the old woman in, and survive. He slumped his shoulders, defeated. The bulldog had been broken. He stepped aside, holding the door open. "Bring her in," Higgins whispered. The Lincoln Zephyr rolled slowly up the driveway, its tires crunching on the gravel. Bumpy opened the back door and helped his grandmother out. She was tired, clutching her Bible, but her head was held high. As she walked up the steps, Chief Higgins stood pressed against the railing, unable to look her in the eye. He was the most powerful lawman in the district, yet in that moment he was nothing more than a doorman. Bumpy guided her past the chief without a word. 2 of Bumpy's men followed, carrying her suitcases and a set of fresh silk sheets they had brought from the city. They walked into the master bedroom, stripped the chief's bed, and remade it with the care of a 5-star hotel staff. Bumpy kissed his grandmother on the forehead. "Sleep well, Mama. You're safe now." As soon as her head hit the pillow, Bumpy walked back out to the porch. He looked at Higgins, who was sitting on a hard wooden bench, swatting at mosquitoes. Bumpy snapped his fingers. Instantly, the streetlights flickered back to life. Inside the house, the hum of the refrigerator returned. The air conditioning unit groaned and kicked on, blowing cool air into the bedroom where Mame Johnson was sleeping. The water pressure returned to the pipes. "The power is back on," Bumpy said, buttoning his jacket. "For her, not for you." He walked down the steps, got into his car, and the wall of men silently dispersed into the night. Leaving the chief alone on his own porch, the next morning, Mame Johnson moved back to a new apartment in Harlem, fully paid for. Chief Higgins requested a transfer to a desk job in Staten Island 3 days later. He never evicted another tenant, and he never set foot in Harlem again. The message had been received, loud and clear. You can fight the law and maybe win, but you never ever fight Bumpy Johnson.